if any of the speakers have some burning comments that they want to make. Are there any questions? Okay, are there questions or comments that the speakers would like to add to their presentation? Oh, okay.
Okay, so this is actually mostly for Rhea.
And
Dr.
I'm
Boyd.
sorry, would you please give your name for the recorder?
I'm Samantha Kaplan, a prior fellow. So I was listening to you, and I was thinking a little bit about a couple things, because it sounded very reminiscent. It sounded reminiscent of gene mapping, and the whole conversation about what are we going to do when we know the genome, and how we're going to control it, and how are people going to use it, and this is very bad, and rich people are going to be able to choose disease treatment, and they're going to be able to choose the sex of their babies and create the superior race and all that other stuff. So that was one thing that it is very reminiscent of. And then the second thing was stem cell research, which is another, oh my gosh, we're going to have stem cell research, and this is going to be terrible, and we have access to this information, and there's no regulation, and we tout it as though it is going to be life-saving, and it really could be harmful. Those move very slowly. So, the science is progressing, and it is progressing quickly in terms of how it used to progress, but it still moves slowly enough that conversations kind of fade away. It's super, super costly. It's hard to get it out to everybody, so everybody's greatest fear has not yet manifested itself, well, at least to the degree we thought it would. Tech is moving so fast. It is so fast that before the conversation has been had, things are out there in people's hands. You can alert all of us and make us panicked, but who is actually going to regulate it? When you have this talk and you say this, who do you envision is going to do this work?
I love that you asked that. Denise, can you hear me on this? Part of why I wanted to talk about public leadership is because I think we have to be those people. I wanted to plant a seed in everybody's mind so you can go back to your workplace when somebody else presents a new innovation that's going to come around how you're shifting your electronic medical record or combining your system. Like I work now with a 211 in San Diego, and we have a community information exchange there, which is a digital platform that connects all the health services, computer systems like the electronic records with all the social service providers in San Diego County. And it's touted as amazing success, but the conversations we've been having from the beginning are who holds us accountable when we get this wrong? Even if just when patients complain and say, we don't want to be a part of this, like where does that get reported to? And so part of my role has been to take it on as the organization in the absence of outside accountability to say we have to create accountability metrics and then make them publicly available so that the public and advocates can hold us accountable to what we are trying to do inside. I think it's a challenge when the innovation outpaces regulation, because I think the ultimate level of accountability will be laws that shape who benefits and how that benefit is shared among people from these digital innovations. But in the absence of those laws, or while we wait for them and hopefully they come and we advocate for them, I think we as individual providers and whatever our role is to create that accountability structure in our organizations now. And I'm curious if other people have examples of how they've done that.
Yeah, I would make the comment that what we got to get smart about is simultaneously building the data around policy development as we build our approaches to using digital technologies. There's an interesting example. Well, you can look at the 2016 election and see it as an example, but really if you look at the Brexit situation in England, that's a real example of predictive analytics, micro-targeting going awry, whereas they drew the circle and a third of the people really didn't care about Brexit. In other words, there was a third for it, a third against it, and a third that didn't really care but were passionate about other things. And so they dissected that population and through micro-targeting got them to migrate to the Brexit side, but tapping into their passions about either nationalism or taking control of their lives or whatever it might be, but reframing it in the way that would support Brexit. So there is a dark side to this, clearly, and I think Ria's presentation really captured the issue about the need to simultaneously address public policy even as these new digital inventions come on board.
We only have data for 100,000 patients, but as a company that wants to have more patients, we've come up on the front end with data use and storage policies. So I think it can't just happen from the external, it has to happen from internal, and maybe the external can help that happen through regulation. Like you must have, a standard with these type of criteria or these type of safeguards. So just an example is no client of ours gets to keep their data by themselves. We de-identify the data and we show it. On the other hand, we've decided not to collect certain data. In Indonesia, they make you say, are you Christian, are you Muslim, or are you Buddhist? You're not allowed to be even another. And we thought, that can't be good. So we decided not to collect that type of data. Instead, we collect some type of education data, but even that could have some ill effects. So I think, we haven't gotten to that point, but I think the next step would be then to have a committee or a part of our organization that consists of community members that helps us decide, broadly defined, that helps us decide who gets to see and own that data.
If I can just add something that came up earlier, is the use of blockchain for, and of course this is more in Western world type of thing, but the possibility of using blockchain to allow patients to own and manage their data, for example, much like you choose to opt into your physician's network if you want to do the My Portal or whatever, My Health Portal, whatever, and having more control. Of course, it requires a lot of education, it requires access, so I'm not saying that's the panacea, but when we look at the possibility of using technologies like that to provide a structure by which we manage our data both as healthcare consumers and as providers, then there's some possibility that we're going to get there.
Question?
Brian Swan. I just wanted to say that I appreciate all of your presentations, the amount of thought and expertise. I would like to hear, if you don't mind me asking, what questions or statements you would have of one another, having put so much time and emphasis in what you're doing. Thank you. So maybe somebody can start by asking, because you're smiling over there. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll start. Ria is obviously just a wonderful speaker, but why I was almost embarrassed to follow her was because she's talking about real, social determinants of health and disease. It's actually why I started my talk with a definition of healthcare disparities. Because even amongst us experts here, we often conflate the two. We call health disparities and healthcare disparities, and they're totally different things. Mm-hmm. And I feel like sometimes just focusing on healthcare is just scooting the issue. We'll say, it doesn't matter your access, it doesn't matter if you face discrimination, stress, whatever. We'll just deal with what we do here. But we know from that awesome graph of yours, only 10% of all human health is determined by access to healthcare. So we as doctors must make sure that access is to quality care, but then also use our status as health leaders to ask to do something about that the other 90%.
Okay, I'll ask a question actually of you, Sally, because you're the one person from industry on the panel. So industry has a financial incentive to continue to roll out new technologies that they keep proprietary, that they make money off of. And when people's data becomes so valuable, has Microsoft thought about, or any of their partners, thought about being a lead organization to say, because nobody's saying this right now, but could Microsoft say, or have you guys already talked about somebody saying, we actually want to reimburse people for how we use your information so that everyone could benefit from those resources, not just from what you produce, but actually from what you get from other people?
So I'm actually quite pleased that you brought that up, because Microsoft, there are 3 or 4 major cloud providers, and I won't mention the others because you already know them, but we do not mine your data. We don't use your data. We have very strict policies within the organization itself, as well as if you read through all those licensing agreements when you go Office 365 and all of that, we don't ever use the data, and it's one of the things that separates us from the other cloud providers. That being said, when we work with our healthcare partners and develop solutions, whether it's something where it's going to be streaming data or it's a dashboard or something like that, we are the underlying tools. We don't own any of the data. We don't own any of the IP, because that's our approach. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember those BASF commercials where we don't make the seatbelts, we make the seatbelts better. We don't make anything other than the tools. And we provide the infrastructure, some of the programs that I mentioned, to foster innovation. But that's where we end. And that is our business model, and that has really blossomed in relationship to the onslaught of data that is now generated today. And so we don't own it, we don't want to own it, because we don't want to be that big brother. We don't want to be looking for opportunities to monetize your data. That's, as a healthcare provider, if you want to take your patient's data and build models and get better at delivering healthcare, that's what we want to foster. That's what we want to help you do. Does that help? So the idea of coming up with a policy doesn't apply to us because we don't actually do that.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
But you work with people who do that, and how in that relationship, because it sounds like you guys don't do that, maybe you could just explicitly say, like, the reason you don't do that, and if the reason is because you guys see how problematic it can be to traffic in data, like, when you enter into contracts with people who you know are doing that, do you have standards? Do you say, we will work with you only under these conditions around how you use this data, or is it, we bring the technology and it's kind of don't ask, don't tell?
No, so this is a question that probably goes beyond, kind of my purview. But what I will tell you is that with the medical device companies, let's say, Stryker, Medtronic, all of that, how they manage their data and how they work with their end customers is their business. And sometimes they choose to monetize, or they'll anonymize and then build models or whatever. But that is on them, so to speak. But I think the overarching question is valid, and I think we do need to look at how we're using data and make sure that it's not used for nefarious purposes. But I want to reiterate that we have a standard by which we operate. We have a focus on making sure GDPR and all of those new HIPAA compliance, all of that stuff, very focused on maintaining compliance with that within our purview, and helping our customers and our partners know that we treat data that way and try and stay away from it, because that's their business model. And if they choose to do that, obviously we're hoping that they're not using it for nefarious, but it's really their business. So I guess we're falling short in your eyes.
I mean, it's not a judgment. I think this is something that we all do, right? Like, we all say, well, my place doesn't do that, but they do that over there and we don't ask a question. And I think that's really the point about public public leadership. Like, how can we all, in the absence of regulation, like the first question, actually hold each other accountable for doing that? And one way of doing it would be in contracting, just to name an example. But we're all not.
One other thing. So, I mean, what I said was probably not fair. So I will tell you a story. At our institution, this is Boston Medical Center across town, right, we're this brand new ACO. We're very excited about being an ACO. Or, yes, we are. We are very excited about being an ACO. There's like a whole bunch of administration around it that I don't find so exciting. But, so, you know, big benefit to us if we collect good data on areas where our patients interface with society and are disenfranchised, marginalized, underserved, under-resourced. In fact, we are charged with collecting that data and identifying those patients, and then the question becomes, how do you do it, and how often do you ask them? And if they go to a medicine clinic, and they go to OBGYN clinic, and they're pregnant, and Healthy Start is collecting the information, and PEDS is collecting the information, how many times do we ask them, and who is in charge of it, and what do you do if you unearth something horrific? And then we have this command crisis team, which I thought was for like terrible things that happen in the world, but is actually about patients who have terrible problems. And the patients get bumped up with all of their identifying data within a HIPAA, observing institution, but still up to the command crisis team. In the conversation about how this happened, no doctors. Well, that's not true. One doctor, but not a doctor from each of these places where we collect data regularly with our most vulnerable populations. No patients, like zero. Zero patients were involved in this process. And the next thing I know, there are all these forms that the patients are being asked to fill out that are then entered directly into Epic by the medical assistant. And my job as the doctor is to say, yes, we screened, so that we can get the points for screening. And the most recent one is about substance abuse. And it's not only asking the patients, these are the 5 Ps, about their abuse patterns, but their friends and their relatives and their children and their parents and their neighbors. And I was like, God, will our patients ever answer these questions? Well, a couple of them are pissed off enough to say, you don't get to have this data, and I don't want to answer this. And they're allowed to opt out. But most of them don't know any better, because when I give them a form, they do what I say. But I don't even give them the form. It's all done before I even get there, because nobody ever included me in the conversation about whether that's a good idea or even how it affects my interaction with my patient afterwards, which I would say it does dramatically. Because there's nothing like talking to a patient about their sexual history when you've just like grilled them on whether they use drugs, right? And I say this because it's one thing to say that we are the people who should police this. On the other hand, I think the technology is moving very quickly from a tech standpoint. From a policy standpoint, there are policies driving it. I mean, the ACO formation is driving these changes, and it's a good thing, mostly, right? I mean, we have a whole plan marched out for the next 10 years that will happen like that, and it'll touch on everything you're talking about. So I think it is very interesting, because I think there's been very little thought, and the drivers are now us. Like, we are the socially conscious individuals driving it right now, who want good health care. So.
And just to play that out as the example that they had in that incredible book, Automating Inequality, for like the in Allegheny County in their child abuse reporting system, what would happen is if you were to check off in a survey that you were an aunt of somebody who was reported before, all of that counts as like one ding in the system. So then anytime, say like it wasn't your child, but you were like the family member of somebody whose child was referred to Child Protective Services, that actually counted for you. And then you became somebody who had a prior referral history, even though that wasn't directly, you weren't the primary caregiver to that child. So I think if that's already happening, I would, if you could, talk to the people who go to those meetings or sit in those meetings and ask, how are we protecting the new network of people that we're kind of including in this type of data acquisition, so that it doesn't erroneously kind of trigger people to be at risk, so then they get contacted over something that they have nothing to do with, or shape their access to certain services because it looks like they were on, the criminalized side of a certain system. Like, I think if you can already recognize that now, doing something about it is really important. And the last thing I'll say is, a couple of weeks ago, I also work with my old residency program at UCSF, and we took a trip down to the South, and we went to Tuskegee. It was all to learn about institutional racism. And at Tuskegee, they have a museum that is in their hospital where they used to take care of black polio patients, because as we learned, when polio was an epidemic, before we had the vaccine, black patients, right, care was segregated. They had nowhere to go. So everybody, it became what they called the Black Oasis. Everyone went to this hospital. And now the top floor of what used to be the Black Polio Hospital is a museum to the Tuskegee syphilis experiment and Henrietta Lacks. And when I think about what we're doing with data, I often think about those experiences specifically. So from the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, right, that happened in the city of Tuskegee, but Tuskegee University actually was said to the CDC, yes, we will do this study. And then, you know, it was the black nurse, who now I'm gonna blank on her name, I think it was Nurse Brown is her last name, who actually went out and recruited the patients and told them to continue to come back, right? And then they had a whole exhibit to how after Henrietta Lacks' cells, although that happened at Hopkins, were harvested, at Tuskegee, their scientists there were the ones who contributed to the creation of the polio vaccine. They contributed to the mass production of the HeLa cells. And so we asked, like, how do you feel about this? This is a very curious space where we're talking about ethics and science. And how do you feel about participating in what has been like the exploitation of your own people? And, you know, it was a conflicted response. They have reached out to the family, the Lacks family, and included them in Vincent Tuskegee. But I think as I think about this digital space and my own participation in my local community information exchange, I am very much so thinking, like, am I Nurse Brown? Am I the person who's saying, come into this new digital space that we've created? I can think of all the ways that this is good for you, but I haven't done due diligence to think about the ways that we're protecting you from harms that could happen. Like, I haven't done due diligence to make sure that although, like in San Diego County, the police is included in our community information exchange, and the Department of Homeland Security paid for the inclusion of the police in our community information exchange because they wanted to know immigration status of patients who come to the hospital, right? Like, we didn't have that conversation before that happened. And so it's not to point fingers at all or blame and shame. It's to say we can all be conscripted in this and feel like you're kind of winning when something goes well, like you develop a vaccine, but on the backside of that, like, what are the implications of what we're doing, and how can we all take accountability for those implications?
Hi, I'm Chandi Ghosh. I'm a former fellow, or current Reed fellow. I want to expound a little bit on what you've touched on before. I understand this laser focus on healthcare because we're a bunch of providers, and AI and technology is so sexy, and there's so much money in healthcare. And you know, U.S. it's what, $3 trillion in healthcare. But if we look at history and look at the history of humanity, what made us healthier and live longer is really public health, prevention. It's the air we breathe, the water we drink, the foods we eat. And I'm afraid you're all going to fail in your endeavors if somehow these technologies don't direct us into better prevention. You might get that diabetic all great, but the minute they leave the hospital and are eating the same foods, drinking the same water, et cetera, they're going to be right back in, and then that technology is going to, prime them up again, and then you throw them out again. But have your technologies done anything about prevention? Because that's what's going to make us healthier.
So, great comment, and part of the reason I phrased the forces shaping health and healthcare, and the title was such, is that we are moving somewhat slowly from the conceptual framework of focusing on healthcare to health. And in doing that, the digital technologies offer the promise of putting more power back into the individual and into communities to help influence what goes on in, again, those 525,000 minutes that people actually spend out where they live, work, and play, rather than the 60 minutes that they're going to spend in the doctor's office during any given year. And the underlying thought there is that what happens out there and all of those influences, to include those social determinants, as has been already said, are much more powerful in determining the outcomes, and that's where we have the promise of addressing health literacy, addressing behaviors, perhaps through some of these digital connections. You can discover, and this is again the good and the bad, very interesting things when you explore social media about how people think about health and certain activities in your life in terms of behaviors that may impact health, and how do you introduce perhaps more evidence-based information into that network to help educate folks. Digital technologies, so the smartphones, right, they can actually respond in a lot of different languages, right? So we talked about that case of, I think, one of the health actually one of your questions, Wilson, was about the issue of the health provider who just said, I'm going to give the instructions to the patient in language my language rather than in the language. Well, using smartphones, again, you can actually have language that's appropriate for the given culture. One of the projects that one of our researchers is working on has to do with what he calls digital coaches, and the impact of using culturally appropriate digital coaches that, in fact, can provide information, particularly in maternal and child subjects, to educate patients, and through a randomized controlled trial have shown that it's effective. If we're smart about all of the issues that Ria has brought up about ensuring that we don't bake racism into these digital technologies to promote health, and continue the conversation about moving from healthcare to health, I think we can have a positive impact.
The only thing I would add is that the technology itself, as we all know, is not going to do it by itself, and I think we have a long way to go in terms of educating not only the end patient and customers, but also the healthcare professionals. There have been studies that show that overweight doctors don't talk to their overweight patients about being overweight. It's too painful, it's too close to home. So there's also some studies that show that 3 months after somebody gets like an Apple Watch or a Fitbit, that the novelty is worn off and they don't use it anymore. So while I totally agree philosophically that we do need to move in from healthcare to health, we're not there yet, and the technology is there to some extent, but I'm not sure, as at least in this country, as a society, we're ready to listen, frankly.
Just a small comment. One thing that's really rewarding about working internationally is that people really do suffer acute events, or acute trauma, or acute infectious disease, where adherence to protocols really makes a difference. There's even a larger connection between good quality health care and public health. I remember working with Paul Farmer in Rwanda way back in 2006, and I said to him, why the antiretrovirals? I mean, it's all economic, and he berated me, as he berates a lot of people. And he said, do you know that before there are antiretrovirals, no one would come to care? No one would come out of the closet. So there is a link between treatment and public health, but it can't be overplayed. And maybe one final example is in the Ebola crisis. What people don't realize is about 20 times more people died of non-Ebola than Ebola, because every single hospital was closed for a year. And I remember when we were trying to open up the hospital, the public hospital in Monrovia, that anytime there was some type of scare, because things weren't connected, you couldn't really see what was happening on the provider level. Someone would present with fever and vomit. Okay, the whole system shuts down again. And so the ability to make clear what is happening with the patient and provider relationship has, at least in the case of epidemics, a lot of public health implications.
Carol Zaydenman, DentaQuest. I just wanted to give an analog to go back to the topic about do no harm with the digital data. And maybe this is not a perfect analog for what we can do, but I thought it'd be worthwhile to share. So in Massachusetts, when we were dealing with the issue of measuring quality in healthcare, ultimately what ended up happening when the hospitals and doctors began to reflect on it, they decided that it would be better for them to get engaged to define the standards and to influence them than to have those standards be imposed on them. You could view what's happening with Facebook right now, going from the digital village to the digital living room, as I think Mark Zuckerberg beginning to understand that himself. I would suggest that what happened with quality conversation is hospitals, physicians, payers, community, other stakeholders all got together and ultimately ended up having a conversation. Massachusetts ended up being a leader in beginning the conversation at the national level. So this was an instance where, again, innovation, technology, et cetera, exceeded our ability to regulate and define standards. So I do think that we all have a stake. I think it's a really good point. And I would hope that we begin those conversations maybe similar to this analog.
You guys have addressed the important topic of who owns the data. And recently, I'm afraid of Ancestry DNA. I signed up for it, but now you can download your own codons, your whole in a Word document. And I was able to identify a cousin, but I was disclosing my uncle. So although I accepted the risk for my data being breached, I also in some ways disclosed my uncle's data. And so just because a patient may say, I want my data to be in this database, we're actually also exposing our family and communities and other people to risk. And if you Google right now, reputation score, and you put your name in, my reputation score is actually lower because one of my family members filed bankruptcy. So reputation score, put your name in quotations. Can you imagine being able to Google one day what your health score is? And all of these things. Who's regulating this? And it's not just us, but we're putting communities and people at risk. So thank you for addressing that.
Yeah, you've brought up a whole sort of basket of issues, and part of it is even if you wanted to do the most responsible approach to public policy, as Samantha said, this train is moving really fast, and the second and third order effects of it are yet to be known in many ways. But the genomic data is really moving ahead. So they're actually catching all of these criminals now as a result of these public databases, because they can triangulate and link back to geographic area, relatives, get data, genetic data, and then zoom in. And on the one hand, that may be a public good, but in fact, there's a potential for that downside, if you will. This gets back to the original point I was making, that we've got to ramp up our interest in our activities on looking at what we should be doing in terms of researching the approach to public policy almost simultaneously. And we need to do that in a very rigorous fashion. I had the responsibility to go testify before Congress a number of times, many times, when I was the Assistant Secretary. And the reason I bring that up is because our legislators often don't act in terms of developing laws from a purely evidence-based approach. In fact, I used to use this graphic that looked like a target, and in the middle was evidence, and then there was economics and politics, but there was this big ring on the outside that was red, and it's called emotion, basically. And so if you don't get ahead of the curve and you don't put the right arguments together based upon evidence, you will get bad legislation and bad policy as well. So the policy piece can't be underplayed or overstated in its importance as a parallel set of activities to the development of digital technologies.
I will also say, while Mallory comes up really quickly, I think it can't go without saying that the reason we don't have these regulations right now are because the tech companies are the richest and the most powerful, and they don't want us to, right? Like, they are actively fighting their own regulation. And we in healthcare, I think, could consider entering that discussion and saying they need to be regulated because as we use this data, we can already anticipate the harms. Like, we speak in terms of human harms, in terms of morbidities. And if we could articulate that to the tech sector, I think it would be powerful. But we really can only do that if we can disconnect our own financial interest from using the data from the needs of the people whose information it really is.
Thank you for a wonderful panel. It strikes me as I've listened that there's a couple things. The first assumption is all of the good that we're going to be able to do. If we, as doctors, are serious about being able to counsel families on a primary care level about gun prevention, okay? It strikes me that the digitalization of the medical record makes that a bigger leap for us as doctors to do that if we are now creating some sort of implicit gun log in the medical record of who owns guns and who doesn't own, how are they stored, etc. And so there are some constraints that I'm seeing as I listen to the good that can be done in my personal practice as a physician, as a trauma surgeon, that I'm seeing with the digitalization of people's medical record. And we shouldn't be naive. Wealthy people's health records have never been consolidated. We know this. We didn't write everything down. And so are we going to still have those two standards in the digitalization process, where poor people and disadvantaged people, their health information is all consolidated and you can sift through it and everything there's fine, but if you live on this side of town, the year you disappeared from high school for 3 months is just kind of left out. And so I do think that we have to take the deeper thought that Rhea is advising us about. Even with the purest of intentions and the greatest people doing it, I'm seeing some problems with executing great care using what's being suggested. And I like your thoughts about it as other providers of care, certainly, and people who may want to push back against those assumptions that I just made. Thank you again for coming and the thoughtfulness of your approach.
So your points are well taken, and again, thanks to Rhea for bringing this into sort of a social consciousness discussion, because it could have taken a purely technical discussion, and the deeper dimension of with forethought planning how you're going to use data so that it does the most good and doesn't do harm is very real. Having said that, I think we would be naive if we didn't recognize again that even if we decided today that we wanted to put a halt on the digitization of the health sector, that's not going to happen because it's happening throughout, it's pervasive throughout society. The other issue is that even if we as doctors could exert that influence, I'm not sure that our voice would be any more powerful than any other segment of society to include business in terms of promoting and developing the technologies and invading the space. And the issue is that if you look at historically, part of the reason we're here in terms of a lot of the inequities in healthcare and disparities was of our own doing. So through the 20th century, right, physicians were at the top of the pyramid, and we created the knowledge, we sort of priced and monetized the knowledge, we paternalized the knowledge, and created our own sort of inequities in the system. Fast forward to today, where we don't control information flow anymore. There are other stakeholders in the system, both within healthcare and outside the healthcare, that have just as much powerful influence. And this also gets back to the issue about legislators, lawmakers. They are just as powerful, if not more powerful, in this space than sort of the professional communities in shaping exactly which laws are made. It gets back to the point I made before, is that we've got to get smarter about this, and we've got to make sure we partner with the right other communities, both tech or community-based, to ensure that we give the perspective that Rhea has given this afternoon about taking a deep breath and understanding what the downside is, and then beginning to have the right discussion around public policy and regulation and laws that need to be enacted to make sure that we do the most good.
I guess one can never think that they're powerless. I was thinking, I use Epic every single day, and I've always wondered, why am I using such a crappy system that is hostaging the data for sale, even though we just paid $1 billion for it? Now, I'm not sure I'll be the martyr that just stops using Epic one day at work, but it's not like doctors don't have a power to influence collection and use of data.
Hi. Amazing presentations. I am hoping that I can get some of it from a recording or from your PowerPoints or whatever, because I didn't have enough time to take pictures. But as you probably know, Rhea, we're on the cusp at the California Department of Social Services of implementing statewide predictive analytics for child welfare. And all of those concerns that you're talking about are weighing on me heavily every day. And the problem is, on the other side of the coin is the occasional child death. And when that happens, we get all the counties clamoring for, give us this tool, we need tools to do a better job. And so it's always this back and forth, and I've really pushed for trying to find some protections and some ways that we can at least minimize the harm. So I'm wondering why you aren't at the table in these conversations. I'd love to invite you, but also, do you have any strategies or ideas for how we can do that accountability at the state level so that we are taking those issues head on of inequities and of harm to communities of color? Right now, just so you know, the people making the decisions are not the communities affected, so that's a big problem.
I mean, we should just talk. So one of my projects has been thinking about bringing more Medicaid dollars down federally to California so that we could pay for more behavioral health services for kids that aren't just clinical services. And as we have that conversation across the child serving systems like child welfare and juvenile justice and the healthcare industry and schools, one of the challenges is that legally, like, the accountability structures for each of those are only owned by that system. So the reason why child welfare feels, not the only reason, but part of the reason why people feel like we really need to do a better job, because if there's ever a negative outcome, it legally falls only on us. When actually the children who are in child welfare, especially if they're on Medicaid in our state, are likely to touch these other systems. They definitely touch the school system, they definitely touch the healthcare system, and unfortunately far too many touch the juvenile justice system. And so we're talking about like this pocket of kids who we can quantify, we know who we are, we know who they are, We know exactly who they touch in the community, and yet I think we still consider ways to roll out programs that make them more vulnerable in some ways. Like, at the same time we're talking about predictive analytics, we're also talking about universally screening all of the kids for adverse childhood events and where that score will go and how that will determine what services kids get across our states. Like, these screens are really concerning. I really think we should talk, because I was just talking to the Office of, in DHS in California, we have an office of, it's like OAI or something, the chief informational strategist or whatever for DHS. And they actually very much so want to have a conversation about, like, what are the implications of this? How can we already put safeguards in? And also, before it even starts, could you start measuring it so that we can, when that starts happening, when we use predictive analytics and start getting it wrong, that we can say, oh my gosh, like, we captured it. So it doesn't have to be so many people later that we got it wrong, and then we appreciate, oh, that wasn't the best system. Like, we could predictively, right, look at our predictive analytics to say what's a problem with it. So we should really talk and probably have, meet up.
This is hi. Aloha. How are you guys doing? All right. I just want to put a little bit of historical perspective on this. 21 years ago, I was in the second class of the fellowship, and there were only 3 fellows that had gone through. And back then, I was super interested in quality. So Crossing the Quality Chasm was still in draft form, and whoever started IHI, I actually talked to him before he started IHI. And what I was interested in was the SHIP program, was the Children's Insurance Program, and whether doctors, physicians, or anyone else were part of designing and implementing the quality programs within that. Now I see 21 years later what's happened, and my colleagues, they're all stressed out because they're doing the same thing. They're just doing checklists because they have to do checklists. They don't really, it hasn't made them care about quality. They haven't felt that. And I'm wondering if this is kind of the same thing that's happening in digital health now. Fast forwarding to now, we have 130 fellows, a lot of Reed scholars. I think that we have a chance now to actually make an impact in terms of what we think should be happening, especially with this topic. And given that the topic's going to be coming up next year, perhaps that could be something that we could do.
Yeah, a quick comment. Thanks for bringing that up. I think one of the points you're making about more checklists and all of the comments that have been made about EHR and the like is because they've never really, those quality improvement tools, if you will, were about incremental change and really have been operating in what I call the analog system. In a really digital system in which it derives benefit, it increases effectiveness and efficiency, and so that gets back to the 3 A's I was talking about before. There should be an automatic way of collecting that data. It really should augment what the physician can do and amplify their capabilities to care for patient rather than detract from those abilities and just add more work.
I really wasn't talking about digital in terms of quality.
Yeah.
I was talking about digital in terms of what Rhea was addressing, in terms of the disparities and how our people are just taken advantage of a lot of times. Yeah.
Hi, I just wanted to share maybe a resource. So I remember a couple years ago, I went to a meeting that was hosted by the Data Privacy Lab at Harvard University. And I'll just read what they are about. So the Data Privacy Lab is dedicated to creating technologies and related policies with guarantees of privacy protection while allowing society to collect and share private or sensitive information for many worthy purposes. So that may be a organization you can start with. Yeah.
Are there any other questions or comments? remarks? Well, let's give our speakers I just want to thank you very much. This was a very dynamic and very provocative topic, and you all brought us a lot of information. So, and this is part one. We will continue this topic next year because, as you can see, we just barely scraped the surface. So there's so much more to be said and so much more for us to learn, so that we can all participate and be responsible and react appropriately to this new change in technology. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
So thank you all so much for coming. We appreciated your attention and your participation. We would like you to continue the conversation in an informal manner by participating in our reception. So it's started kind of already in here, and you can float around outside, and we're welcome to bring back your refreshments in here. I'd also like to remind you there should be evaluation forms on the table. If you could please just fill out the evaluation forms. You can leave them on the table. We will pick them up. If there's anyone who wanted a program book that did not get one, or wanted a copy of our newsletter that did not get one, we do have extra copies up front. For those scholars who are still in the room, we do have an informal networking social later on this evening at 6:30. You can see me for details. If there are no other questions, thank you again, and have a good night.